Want to welcome everybody to Theaster's house. And I particularly like how the acoustics work, that the smattering of applause turns into the volume of a standing ovation. So I like that feature a lot for how your house works here. And Theaster and I have an agreement. He's working to help me be hip, and I'm working to help him not swear in public. I think I'll be far more successful than he will be helping me become hip for that. So we're here today to spark some mischief and some magic. We've got a really remarkable panel here. I want to kind of frame the task that we have, put it into context of the Chicago Community Trust being born 100 years ago out of the progressive movement in Chicago, and the movement given physical shape by the vision of Daniel Burnham. The Trust has contributed to successive cycles of reinvention of this city, and it's precisely that capacity to embrace reinvention that has enabled Chicago to grow and flourish. But as investment managers are required to say, past performance is no guarantee for future success. And I'm afraid we're at one of those inflection points as a great city and region. And I'm afraid that there are signs that we're losing our mojo and our sense of swagger and confidence here. There was an interesting article by Allison Arif in the New York Times in February about whatever happened to great urban design projects. Perhaps you saw that one. And she says, what makes them great is they're bold, courageous, unusual, and even strange. Like this bank, bold, creative, unusual, even strange to think of the possibilities that we reside in here. But she goes on to talk about a century later, we've lost our collective faith in the power of great projects like the Golden Gate Bridge, not to mention our trust in government to fix a pothole on time or even create a budget. So how can we even have a inspiring bridge? And then she turns to, shockingly, inspiration from Atlanta, which is putting the finishing touches on the Atlanta Beltline, and how this is one of the largest far-reaching urban projects underway in our country. Describes the Beltline as this compelling vision. Quote, it wasn't just a trail, wasn't just a transit line, it was a catalyst, something everyone could be part of. It tapped into the ambition that the city had for itself, that it could be a great city. And when I was reading that, I thought, now wait a minute, that's Chicago. We're the city that makes no little plans. We're the city of big shoulders. It's us, that's our legacy. Unlike any other city in the world. And then we look farther out. If you look at Seattle's comprehensive plan, it's called Managing Growth to Become an Equitable City. The intention of that plan is simply and eloquently stated in the opening line. Seattle is a growing city. We use this comprehensive plan to manage growth in a way that benefits all the city's residents and preserves the surrounding natural environment. The mayor writes in it, for the last 20 years, Seattle has been recognized as a leading green and sustainable city. We showed how a large city can grow and still conserve water and electricity, reduce waste, and erect some of the greenest buildings in the world. But over the next 20 years, we must address an even bigger challenge, the growing inequality in our city. It's building a more equitable and sustainable city that is more than managing growth. It's more than offering transportation options, reducing environmental impact. It means reducing poverty and creating an enduring economy, increasing access to education, and fostering livable, affordable, inclusive neighborhoods. That is my vision for Seattle, says the mayor there. Their core values are driven, number one, race and social equity. making racial equity a reality. You will see that with the Chicago Community Trust, our top priority, race and equity. The second is economic opportunity and security, livable wages and equal opportunity. The third is environmental stewardship. But listen to how they frame that, committed to making Seattle carbon neutral by 2050. That is an ambitious goal. That is making no little plans. And then their fourth is community, to make Seattle the best city for living, working, and raising families, encouraging broader public participation in all aspects of the city. You see the same theme echoed in the Portland plan, which has a diagram, an infographic right at the center is equity. It's like a beacon shining brightly, organizing all of the elements of their plan. So in conclusion, I think our sense of inevitability is threatened by an anemic vision out of touch with the realities of a climate-challenged global economy fueled by job-eating technology. Everything is different today. Let me say that again. Our sense of inevitability is threatened by an anemic vision out of touch with the realities of a climate-challenged global economy fueled by job-eating technology. So there's a saying in the planning world that planning is bringing the future into the present so that we can do something about it now. That is the purpose of On to 2050. And today I think we have the antidote to this anemic vision with a truly extraordinary panel of visionaries who are bringing forth a new paradigm of urban vitality. The panel includes our host, Theaster Gates, world-renowned artist, working at the intersection of art and urban planning. He has the very academic-sounding title of Professor of the Department of Visual Art and Director of Arts and Public Life for the University of Chicago. Founded numerous nonprofit organizations like the Rebuild Foundation and awarded the Artes Mundi 6 Award recognizing contemporary visual artists. And we have Gia Biaggi, urban planner, strategic thinker. She's the Senior Director for Urbanism and Civic Impact. Sounds like one of the coolest job titles I could ever hope for. Before that, she's worked with the Park District and president of Neighbor Space, a nonprofit land trust. And then finally, to round out the stellar, we bring in the scientific acumen with Charlie Catlett, the senior computer scientist at the US Department of Energy's Argonne National Laboratory. It heads up the mathematics and computer science division, so he does all of the cool futuristic work. And prior to that, he was the chief technology officer at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications and founding director of the Urban CCD at the University of Chicago. And what he will tell us about his work on the array of things is truly mind-blowing. So with that as our lineup, let's give home field advantage to Theaster to provide some opening remarks.
Thanks, Terry. Hello, everybody. So if we were to try to keep in perspective this idea that today's conversation is about future, and it's a future out 35 years, I've been trying to think about what have I been trying to do for the last 35 years? And if I knew 35 years ago at 7 years old what I know now, how would I lived my 35 years, in terms of a shaping. And a couple things were really interesting to me at 7 years old. At 7 years old, I lived on the west side of Chicago, Chicago Avenue in Pulaski. Crack had hit And it was very quickly destroying the lives of men and women who I knew when I was 5, who, when I would see them at 7, were only shadows or skeletons of themselves. There was a Sears, there was a Spiegel outlet warehouse manufacturing building on Lexington and Holman. It was where my grandparents and one of my sisters lived. And I remember they were on the last days of Sears, Roebuck, and Spiegel. And black men who used to work there were now stealing from the trucks, trying to grab any merchandise that might be in a truck by the last warehousers who were warehousing, only to try to sell it to my mom, who, because of Jesus, never took the hot items. I remember thinking, why would these brothers break into these trucks? And, it seemed like we had everything we needed. I could eat well, I was going to school, things were looking good. And then every once in a while, Alan would come by with some stuff, and he'd be like, "Miss Gates, you'll never believe what I have today." Like, what you got today, Alan? I got some women's raincoats, got some furs, some shoes. Anybody in your house wear a size 11? Right? But there was this kind of desperation that I didn't quite understand at 7 that was happening on the west side of Chicago. And that these people who were great and loving people who had held me and nourished me, by 7, my parents didn't want them at the house. And I remember thinking, what happened? She was so beautiful last year. He was so cool, right? And now, fragments of themselves. I remember at 7, there were these yellow bricked buildings that we called mini mansions across the street from me. And that if there was any vagrants or strange, nefarious activity, I wouldn't have known that word at 7, that the building would be put on a demolition list, and slowly those buildings were all torn down. That the best way to kind of deal with the evils of this world is to just kind of eliminate the view of it. And so if we could tear the building down, it meant that the deviants just went to the next building, and so and so. I understand now that people became very rich tearing those buildings down in my neighborhood. That companies that salvaged the brick and salvaged the metal and that those people were legitimately given city contracts, while friends of mine who, because of crack, would go into those buildings and tear out the pipes and do the same kind of work, were sent to jail. I remember 7. We had government cheese. We made the best the cheese toast ever. It's like the best grilled cheese in my life happened as a result of this cheese.
Big blocks.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that my knowledge of art and geometry has to do with those blocks of cheese. I'm really good at rectangles. But there was a way in which the challenges that my mom and dad had raising 9 children by the time I was 7, raising 9 of us, I didn't realize that the hard work that they did every day, they would go to work, do their thing, that was also being subsidized by a federal government. I just knew that cheese came in the insurance man. And so when I think about those histories of the challenges that happen that seem to interrupt neighborhoods, violence, these black guys didn't make guns, but they had them. I don't know who was making crack, but I don't think it was being made in my neighborhood. That when I reflect on those things, I'm really curious about what are the ways in which we become serious about eradicating the barriers that create inequity. When I think about 2050, I'm constantly thinking about what are the values that we have. I'm not thinking about the creation of new economic centers. I'm not thinking about the need for major rail stations. I'm thinking about things like love and respect, and the belief that people, while they might be different, that they have a right to experience exceeding abundance in this world, And that exceeding abundance doesn't have anything to do with how much money you make. It has to do with your ability to walk across the street and be at Jackson Park, walk across the street and see amazing spaces. Right now, we are really conscious of everybody in this room because the last couple days there have been shootings that happen to the south of us and to the north of us. We are aware that sometimes in great neighborhoods, bad things happen. It's like, I'm really interested in like how love could have prevented 35 years ago some of these 42-year-olds from shooting incessantly. And so I think that the value that I want to hope for, in addition to, say, the redevelopment of the South Side, the redevelopment of the West Side, the need to ensure that we're investing with equity, those things I believe in, that one of the things that I tried to just demonstrate is that if somebody comes up with a little bit of cash, chooses to stay, manifests love, that love might also manifest through redistributing the resources that one has to make great things happen in the neighborhood they live in. And that love becomes a kind of distribution tool by which all of the things that we know in our brains, know in our computers, that we find that love becomes the vehicle that allows us to think about what do we do with the $100 million? Do we invest it in another downtown mega mall, right? Or does that $100 million need to do something throughout our neighborhoods, you know? And so I think that in that way, my vision for 2015 has to do with the adjacency that that ethical values have in relationship to the technical and political and policy-based work that we do.
Very good. We'll follow up more. Gia, your thoughts?
I get to follow that?
You do.
Okay.
You do.
Thank you.
Love is all we need.
Love done. So one, thank you for having me here today, to CMAP and Terry and Theaster for hosting. I'm really excited to hear what Charlie has to say. Yeah, so, you know, for me, you know, urbanism and civic impact, it does sound like a really cool title. And it can be hard to explain, I guess. It's kind of like, you know, a songwriter, you have a great song, you should never explain the lyrics, right? Because they mean something to everyone a little bit differently, and you're giving away the store by being too prescriptive. But the work that we're trying to do, at least where I'm working, and which is for me based on a very long career working for the city, mostly at the park system, more than a decade, with folks here in this audience, and kind of thinking about all of those systems that are at work in a city, but then what does that mean to an individual at that really granular 1-foot level in their daily experience, and how those two things relate with one another. So, you know, the work that we're doing at the studio is kind of looking through urbanism as this big lens. What is all the stuff? What's the ecology of the city? What are the relationships between those things? But what does that mean as you're trying to design cities, and what does design mean, and who has those tools, and who has those tools has some power, who has the right to invest? All of those issues kind of swirl around in that idea that rests on this notion of civic impact, which is thinking about, as you're doing work in places, what are some of the stakes, and then what is the aspirational world we'd like to see together? So which public policy question, or all of them, can you kind of move the needle on in the work that you're doing? So, you know, a lot of the conversations that I'm in usually start with talking about Studio Gang's Aqua building, which is this tower downtown that probably most of you have heard about. And so it's a really beautiful building, and it has this really great story. It's by Lakeshore East, and it actually was able to rise up out of the 2008 financial crisis. And it has some really interesting engineering features, and it basically is doing jujitsu with the wind because of the shape of these undulating plates that kind of move around the facade of the building. And one of the kind of surprise outcomes of that geometry, which started as a structural response to wind, turned out to be a beautiful feature that's also purposefully trying to connect with the other major moments of the public realm that matter to people in that part of the city. So you have Millennium Park, and there's a plate that pulls out and kind of connects with it in a metaphorical way, and it's pulling out and connecting with the lake, and so that's triggering that geometry. But then the piece of the story that's kind of interesting is that what we learned with that shaping is that you get this kind of balcony system where people can actually see each other across their balconies. And what we learned through that and through these anecdotes was that people are building relationships by virtue of being able to see each other on these balconies that are askew. And so it caused us to really think hard about what is the social capacity of these spaces that we're designing. It was sort of this unusual moment in the power of architecture when you drill it down to that 1 foot level, that we can take these physical things and have them be places for capacity. Social capacity, social cohesion. How do we move the needle on those kinds of questions that I think are really at the core, this idea of love and relationships. Those are those things that are hard to wrap your hands around, that you can't really design for, but can designers put on the table some of the tools that can help you get there. So I was in Philly this week actually with some folks from Rebuild and a number of folks from across the world, really, from Copenhagen, who all they could tell us about were their bicycles and how great it is to ride around Copenhagen all the time on bicycles, and folks from Japan and folks from Barcelona and South America. And everyone's sort of talking about what public life means. What does the public realm mean? And there are lots of kind of folks pushing and pulling on what that could mean for a city. And when you think about the public realm, and I think about the future, if you just add up the math on what we own together in the public realm, it's massive. Map all the streets and the parks and the train stations and everything we own, police stations, libraries, we all own that stuff. It's more than 50% of some cities. And so if I think about the future of Chicago, right, and this is a fraught time in Chicago, and I have a kid in the public school system, and we have friends that have been the objects of police brutality and all kinds of things in this city. But in coming to this place today, even on the drive down here, I was thinking, it's time to double down on Chicago, double down on Chicagoland. We have all of these assets that we own in common. So the question is, what can we do as a collective, not just as systemic actors? We have great systemic actors in city planning. We have backbone institutions like CMAP. But from that all the way down to the individuals, what can we do with what we own collectively to do more for communities? I mean, you're sitting in a fantastic example of that, right? A bank. What could you do with it? What could you imagine that it could do differently? But look at the civic assets across the country and what they're doing, and also here in Chicago. Look at libraries, right? Libraries as this, originally membership organizations, you had to pay to get in, but now libraries are having to reimagine what they mean to communities so they can do more for the communities they're residing in. Their core competency, knowledge, lending, borrowing. But what libraries are doing today, they're lending ties. So someone can go on a job interview. They're lending cake pans because not everybody can buy the right size cake pans. They have maker spaces. I'm a little tired of maker spaces, but they have maker spaces with 3D printers that nobody can afford, and they're connecting all of that with job training and English as a second language training and all of these sorts of things. And so I think part of the future, I'm wrapping up, see I'm looking at the watch. Part of the future here, though, is saying we need to together reimagine what we can do with that civic commons. But then we also cannot assume that simply by having those things and reimagining it together, just having a park and being in it together doesn't mean that it's an equitable space. It doesn't mean that we're all treated the same in that space. We talk about the public realm and parks and I'm a parks person, but as these places of democracy, these places that are equalizers. But as we are investing in these commons, hopefully together, and reimagining what they can be, we cannot forget that these spaces, people are treated differently in these spaces. People have different relationships with these spaces. So many of these great civic projects are built on displacement. And so how do we not lose that narrative as we begin to shape our future and invest in it and bring it forward toward reimagining together how all these assets can work for us as a collective. So I think that's part of the conversation for the future.
Your closing thought on the displacement, Saskia Saskin, the great urbanist, wrote a book called Expulsions about how we are expelling from the world large classes of people and resources and all of that, very much in that vein. Feels to me like we've got a Scrabble game going here where Theaster's put down the tiles on exceeding abundance and love, and then you've added to it social cohesion and the public realm and all that. So it's going to be interesting to see what Charlie now puts on the playing board for our virtual Scrabble game.
3 letters.
Well, I should start with something like really geeky, like, oh, Siri is not available. I was going to say set timer for 8 minutes. So how do you go from love to urban design to geeky sensors? When Theaster was talking, I thought of this quote, I'll paraphrase, by C.S. Lewis, who basically at one point he said, you know, at the end of the day or the age, we may find that the difference between the loving person and the crotchety old man is nothing more than a good digestive system. And you know that, I mean, the Snickers commercial, you know that's true. And then, you know, as you were just talking, I thought about the Gutenberg Bible, and you're talking about all the assets that we own, but a person that's walking through the city knows nothing about how those are performing, whether this building that the city owns is a complete waste of energy because nobody's working there, but they're still heating it. And so what I'm trying to do to kind of relate to both of those things is to not just examine cities in more detail, but do it in a way that provides information to people, everyone, so that they can make their own conclusions about what the data is saying. So this project, the Array of Things, which you may have read about in the papers, we're putting some sensors. They have computers inside them so they can actually think. We can program them. But I want to tell you why we're doing it, and then I'll tell you what we're doing. When I first started taking an interest in cities, as a person that is trained in computer science and spent my whole career since Theaster was 7 doing, doing supercomputers and internet and things like that. But I got involved in the project down here, the Chicago Lakeside project, and I was really struck by the process by which a bunch of people from way far away were planning for a community in the south side of Chicago from really nice conference rooms overlooking the lake downtown. And when I asked them, well, you know, what are the people that live there? What do they think about the project? They said, oh, they love it. And what they really meant was that the aldermen loved it. And then, so I said, well, can I come to one of your community workshops? And I came to one of their workshops, and there were like 20 people in the room, and I think only 2 people in the room actually lived on the south side, and the rest of them were consultants and people from industry. So anyway, I thought with that project that I would be able to help them with respect to doing computational models, simulation models that would say, you know, if you put a train in and do this or that, then you don't have to widen Lakeshore Drive until 10 years later. You don't have to disrupt the neighborhood. And as I started thinking about how you might plan for a neighborhood or a part of a city using information, I started realizing that we don't have very much. And the first information I saw when I started looking at the city of Chicago, which is one of the cities that's really at the vanguard of publishing data, is I saw a bunch of maps. I saw a map of life expectancy that struck me, the 14-year difference that just being in one place or another could make. I saw a map of asthma, same thing. Some parts of the city, red with asthma, 20% or more of kids with asthma here, but you go a half mile over here and it's 7 or 8%. And I saw a map of public transit. We actually did a color-coded map. How many minutes does it take to get from your neighborhood to the loop on public transit? And there were these dark areas where it was more than 90 minutes. And I looked at another map of unemployment. It looked very similar. So you probably thought I might talk about smart cities. That's the only time I'm going to use that phrase, because most of the work around applying technology to cities, in my view, it's about being able to park your Tesla more efficiently. Or on a good day, it's about making the buses run more efficiently. But what I think it needs to be is making the buses run to where the buses need to run, not where we thought they needed to run 50 years ago. So I look at maps, and they don't change very often. And then I thought about, well, what's behind some of this? And I looked at maps of crime, changes every hour. Look at a map of air quality, changes every 10 minutes. And we wanted to do some data analysis work on economics. I would like to know, I was driving down Garfield Boulevard with Rudy. I don't remember his last name. Rudy. Okay, so Rudy was giving me a tour of the South Side. I live in Naperville, so I'm not I'm not from around here. So I just wanted to know about the South Side. And he was driving down. He goes, this was where you would take somebody out for dinner or a theater 40, 50 years ago. And I asked him what changed, and he had some theories about that. But it made me wonder, and maybe this is a computer scientist imposing order on the world, or imposing, maybe it's not realistic, but maybe wonder if we could know the state of a neighborhood, the economics of what's happening, how well the coffee shop is doing in the drugstore, and how much noise is waking people up at 6 in the morning when the construction contract says you can't work till 8. If we had that information, would we have been able to tell in 1965 that Garfield Boulevard was going to start heading in the wrong direction in such a way that we could actually turn a knob of some kind, add that would nudge it back into a direction that Theaster would describe as abundance, right? So the array of things then was me looking at the sparse amount of data that we have and asking, well, I'm wearing this Fitbit. I'm not a paid spokesman for Fitbit, but I'm wearing one because I want to know how many steps I'm taking and how long I'm sleeping, because I get, it's not just digestive system, but I don't sleep enough, I also get cranky, right? So what if we had the equivalent of a Fitbit for the city, but not to give information just to some people in nice buildings downtown in their conference rooms, but to people who actually live on the street. Not live on this, to live on the street, but who walk the streets, who are residents of Chicago. So to do that then, I went to the city, I said, can you imagine that we might put a bunch of devices around the city to measure and then publish the data openly, and even do it in a way that a high school kid in one of the high schools in Chicago could write an application for a smartphone that would give them an alert when the air quality is such that they should probably stay inside that day. That's where the array of things came from. Array of things is it's a set of devices. We've got now funding from the National Science Foundation to build 500 devices. They talk over the cell phone network to a database at Argonne, and we publish that data openly, freely, no monetization of this data. And what they do is they look at three things. One, they look at the environment. How hot is it? How humid is it? What's the barometric pressure? Is there vibration right now? How hot is the street surface? Second is they look at air quality, particles, particulate matter, and the specific gases. Is the air quality bad because there's a lot of pollen, or is it because of a lot of these gases that only are produced in diesel engines? And does the vibration tell us there's a truck vibrating, sitting there idling where it shouldn't be? So air quality and environment, and then, this is the tricky part, they have cameras. They have cameras so that we can program them to extract information from images, and then for privacy purposes, throw those images away. By the way, our privacy policies are published for public comment right now. Come to Harold Washington Library on Wednesday night and we'll talk more about it. I'll be there and we'll talk about it. But what we want to be able to do is detect standing water in the street. There's flooding happening. We want the devices to be smart enough to detect that. Imagine 15 years from now, or even 10 years from now, when many of the cars are self-driving, what if the streets were somewhat intelligent as well? What if the streets could flash a light when you're walking out because the light says walk, or maybe it doesn't say walk because there's a bus that's rushing through the intersection? What if we could eliminate, as the Vision Zero says by 2022, what if we could make all traffic fatalities zero? In order to get there, we have to have more information about what's happening on the corners. We'd like to be able to detect near misses, not just accidents. So the array of things then, it's what we hope to be a partnership with people who live in the city who will say, that's my device up there, and I get my air quality from that device, and I get my weather from that device. And that device helps me talk to the city about what's happening in my neighborhood.
So one of the things that I've been observing over the last year or so is that there is a growing insistence on civic engagement, that the paradigms of trusting established institutions to have the right ideas and to carry out the plans has been eroded. And we see it throughout in terms of a number of our civic institutions right now. But there is this resurgence of civic engagement, civic involvement. You touched on that, Giacomo. Like to get your sense of how you are experiencing the community and this demand for a place at the table.
So
And that's for everybody.
I'll say, when it seems like power and decision making belongs to a very small number of people, the desire for transparency and understanding, a desire to be a participant in the things that shape our world, that thing becomes a growing and growing irritant among people. And I think that there's always been this tension in America, in the kind of creation of American culture, where there's this value of democracy, but it's actually these 12 dudes that are like in a room somewhere making up shit, right? And sorry about that.
So we made it 45 minutes.
And at some point, there's this idea that like maybe we're really smart. We're all lawyers. We know best what the rest of this country needs, and we will build our policies based on that. And I think that like there's so many people that are not only are they not being asked, there's so many people more smart and more interesting than the 12 people in the room. And so it's like at that point where power starts to concede that like there's this possibility for democracy, which just means that like the more we can have more voices, the more informed the 12 might be to make better decisions for a whole. So if we have the capacity to first accept that some form of governance is an okay thing, right? The challenge is, can a governance accept that a people have the capacity to make great decisions? And so I think that there's this kind of feedback loop that seems to be broken. And I think that the more that power concedes wealth, the more the ways of managing wealth and growth are a kind of for a protected class, then those fenced communities that keep the possibility of knowledge flow from both sides, then they become militarized, folk become more anxious. And so I think that like part of it just seems to be a willingness to kind of more deeply understand pre-American values around what a democracy might be. Like indigenous forms of shared conversation, historic forms of like a whole community of people sitting together to talk it out over 3 to 5 days, not an hour, not 2 hours. That in fact, it may take a season in order to make the good decisions that would be right for our tribe or our nation. And we're willing to spend the time of a season to do that because we understand that every voice is important. Maybe I'm interested in that kind of relationship between power, governance, and the possibility of citizens and democracy.
Right, like are we willing to invest in community capacity on its face without a project that's getting ready to land somewhere?
Right.
You know, you see there's lots of investments, no offense to any foundations in the room, but we'll see investments in tactile urbanism. Let's do a pop-up park in a parking spot for a day and then we've done something, or let's do these small set of interventions. But what if there was no project and you just had to invest in the kind of community building that helps folks be ready for the next project? What if you took the idea of, I think inclusive growth is a pillar within the CMAP process. So can you really be exhaustively inclusive in your process and be willing to give away, I think, both the timing of the process and maybe some of the values change along the way. And if we can sort of set the table in a way where, you know, I didn't make this up, and I'm sure you've heard it, but you know, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu when it comes to projects, right? And so can we set the table so more people are sitting around it and can decide what we're going to do together? What I say at the office that's probably sacrilegious, which is, I don't care if we build anything. I don't, because I mean,
There's the business
right?
plan.
Shh, don't tell Jeannie, but I don't care, because I do care, but I don't really care, because if we're doing our job right, because there's a moment for us to bring our tools to the table in a community, but if we're doing our job right, then the process has helped the community to build the networks that they'll need for the next thing, the next crisis, or the next project, that sort of thing. So even if no shovel goes in the ground, that neighborhood is a little bit better positioned to manage the next thing that comes along. And hopefully you build that network and you provide access to the tools. One of the questions that I was thinking about what Charlie was talking was, whose hands are on those knobs, right? And I think, how do we get everybody's hands on those knobs? I think is part of the question.
Great. So I can't resist that when you talk about investing in community capacity without a project, on the table is exactly designed to do that.
That was not a setup for you.
It was a wonderful
You're
setup
welcome.
there. You're setting the table and we host on the table. Do you have any remarks you want to add to this?
Well, you know, I was thinking when you were talking about investing over the long haul without a specific project, you know, when people ask me what we're putting up on the poles, I tell them what we're putting up, but in some sense, that's the least interesting thing that we're doing. The most interesting thing that we're doing from my point of view is working with the city to put a live wire up on a pole to be able to put anything up later that we want. So that when there are better sensors for not just that there's pollen in the air, but what kind of pollen, or are there better detectors for, you know, whatever we want to, you know, look for that might be a sign of community cohesion. Maybe we do the baby carriage detector because that's a sign that sociologists tell us is a sign of people feel safe. So we have that wire up there, and we're designing a box that within 15 minutes the city can replace with a new device. So we're sort of trying to plan for the very long haul of how we want to instrument our cities.
Yeah. And
And the conversation we're having that started last week out in Pilsen that will continue Wednesday at the Harold Washington Library is our fumbling, sort of clumsy attempt as scientists to talk to the general public. We're not used to that. We're usually kept in the back room, so.
Okay. So we are going to open this up to public questions too from the audience here, and there'll be CMAP staff who will be going around to collect cards with your questions on it to sort through. But we've got a few more rounds here with our panelists. Did you wanted to jump in on that point?
I just want to respond to Charlie and just talk about bias for a minute. So the live wire goes up, Charlie, and it's pointed across the street at the strip mall. You see 45 black men hanging out, and there's a laundromat across, there's a J&J Fish, there's a barbershop. But you see 45 men essentially doing nothing, right? So the wire is trying, the computer, the super processor is trying to make sense of 45 men standing outside all day doing nothing, right? And it could say, oh, this is a site for tremendous black deviants, right? They're probably gang bangers or looters. The device doesn't have the ability to also kind of configure, this is one of the growth sites that are in desperate need for economic development and regeneration, right? And so it's like also, how do you start to give the processor consciousness or the data analyst the tools to be able to say, yes, in addition to the fact that this thing may be, this site might be a site where deviance happens, it's also a deep indicator of the need for economic redevelopment in this place, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the data is just a north arrow in a way. Something is happening here.
That's right.
There's a pattern, there's something. And I think the trick is, how do you get down to the person who's standing there and say, what's going on?
And this is also where, you know, with what we're trying to do is do this project in an inclusive in a way that's a dialogue with maybe some of the guys that are standing in that strip mall. The transparency of the project hits in several places. One is before we would program that device to detect that it's a black man versus a white man versus a Hispanic woman, there would be a conversation that says, do we want to detect that?
Yes.
If you ask me right now, I would say, I would prefer not to detect that. They don't detect that. But the next, we do want to know how many people are there.
Yes.
More importantly, how many people flow through, how many cars flow through. But that data becomes transparent.
Yeah.
And so it's not just data that then goes into City Hall, and now we've got the data that shows, the report that shows the 45 guys are on the corner, but it's out in the public, and it's a useful number.
Absolutely.
But the transparency, maybe at least our expectation is the transparency will prevent it from getting sent directly into the room full of the 12 dudes who only can look at it.
Okay. So, Theaster, beginning to be a master developer from the principle of love, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, how does that work? It seems like it's running contrary to every textbook principle you could imagine. What are the obstacles that you face and either thwart your ambition or you've got to overcome for you to be successful in realizing your vision?
Mm-hmm. So, this is a big question. Let's say that the way one learns development is at a business school, or in business school they can learn right? You learn real estate finance. You could learn, how to make a deal. And I think that the principles of business school are that construct is right for helping one tackle the business necessary to deal with the growth and change in the city and have that thing be realized in a particular kind of economy, in this case, a capitalist economy. But what if I learned real estate development in divinity school? And divinity school had all of the same levers of how putting a deal together works, and the creativity necessary for an entrepreneur to kind of figure out how space works, how funds work, how people work, where people want to live, and you put all those things together. But it's happening with this other driver alongside it, this adjacent driver that happens to be the question of a moral or ethical implication, right? To learn redevelopment at a Shaker school or a Buddhist school, in this case. In a Buddhist school for redevelopment, Buddhism may say, like the Ise Shrine, every 20 years we're gonna tear this temple down and rebuild it. And the reason that we're going to do that is because we want to ensure that there are future temple builders. And also, the deconstruction of the temple allows us to pay these monks for the next 20 years, and everybody in the city adjacent to the temple who uses the temple will participate in investing in these monks who are essentially master craftsmen. And I like this idea that one could either be driven to develop and say, there's going to be growth in Tokyo at 7%, and we want to make as much money as we can doing that. Or it's really important that we protect our temples, and alongside that growth, people need more places to worship. And more tourists are going to come who can't afford to be in Japan, and they'll want to stay in our monastery, and so and so. And so I think that in some ways, what I've been trying to imagine is that in addition to the conventional drivers of development, which are absolutely necessary in order to help a city grow, there might be other adjacent drivers. In my case, I happen to be an artist, so the affect of seeing a building built is more interesting to me than the profit to be made as a result of the building being successful. So because I have the luxury of considering affect alongside money, and because the driver that drives the development corporation that we have built is super excited about just the fact that this neighborhood is being restored, then alongside money being a driver, beauty is a driver, and the possibility that like more good times could happen. Now, it may not be a bulletproof business plan in order to make the thing work, but what's happened is it's attracted more conventional kinds of economic drivers and development drivers, that in fact, when there was no there still needed to be an investment here. And in that case, the only thing that would make someone invest in a place that is not worth investing in is faith, or a belief in beauty, or a belief in black people, or a belief in oneself to change in a self-deterministic way the barriers that keep a place from growing. And I think that we're somewhere between conventional development and a development that has another driver that might consider beauty before money.
That is. Gia, building on that, from the studio gang perspective, what do you see as the missing drivers that would help you to realize the vision of Studio Gang?
Wow.
It's only lightweight questions
Yeah, that's also a large question. Well, I mean, I do think that this notion of having great backbone organizations that I mentioned previously, this idea that there are organizations that are conveners, and if they can do it in a way that's really longitudinal, that's not spiking for a particular planning moment or an anniversary, but is consistently being as inclusive as possible, and working together with other backbone organizations, the more that those organizations can exist and be doing that ongoing one-foot level work with communities, then when there is a project, then you can have trust in that network that's been created, because it's been a very long process with the right people, hopefully at the table, there for the long term. But I was thinking, as I was listening to what Theaster was saying, part of what makes that kind of investing work with an alternative lens, I think, is having faith and producing that proof of concept. It's sort of, you need to deliver something, so you got to have a lot of faith. But once you do that, these things can take flight. I mean, you look at Black Ensemble Theater, right? A theater whose mission is to eradicate racism, and being able to craft programming, to fundraise for a new facility, to continue to push the dialogue, but using the tools of theater and performance to do that, you can do these things. Those examples are there. So I think part of it too is doing a good job of revealing what's there in the world where people are doing these good works and saying, well, wait a second. There's a whole range of ways that people are looking through these alternative lenses and matching up things that are non-traditional with development.
Could I maybe jump in?
Yeah, and if, as you jump in, I also want to talk about, there's a hidden economic opportunity in your work, if you can also talk about that.
Exactly. We found ourselves with this project wanting to measure the city that we had to have 500 pieces of hardware and software that nobody made or sold. So we thought, oh, that's okay, we know how to do hardware and software, we'll make our own. And we made 12, and we realized that to make 12 of something by hand is different than making 500 of something. You can't afford to make 500 of something that's too much time. So we found ourselves in the position where we needed to find somebody to mass produce something that we designed. And that meant mass producing custom circuit boards. It meant making modifications to off-the-shelf computers, and it meant taking a internal design, functional design, marrying it together with an aesthetic design that came from Doug Pancoast at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, into something that, from a mechanical engineering and materials point of view, could be affordably made. And what we talked to companies from Silicon Valley and Arizona that wanted to just take our designs, miniaturize them, and give them back to us. But we really wanted to have this thing not just be designed in the Chicago area, but made in the Chicago area. And ultimately, we'd like it made in Chicago. We haven't gotten there, but we do now have a device that's being made in the Chicago area. 4 companies that we're working with. And one of the things that we did when we went out for bids for these companies, like an injection molding company, people said, you're gonna have to go onto somewhere on the other side of the Pacific Ocean to do injection molding. It'll be too expensive to do in the US. We said we want to be able to drive to the place and sit down with the people and talk to them about things. And that's worth a little more money to us to pay for the injection molding. We want to sit down with the mechanical engineers and look at the different kinds of materials they might use or how they might coat the materials. We don't want to do that through email or get on a 12-hour flight to do that. And it turned out that not only were we able to find these 4 companies in the Chicago area, including the injection molding company, but they weren't more expensive than going somewhere else. So because we started with this notion that this is a Chicago thing, we should do this in the Chicago area, we were able to find those sources and do it. And our next thing that we want to do is try to find a way. Now we have to build 500 of these for us. We're up to 40 cities that have asked, can you send us 10 of these to do pilot projects or more? Some Newark one's 50. And so we might have to make thousands of these, and we'd like to be able to not just drive there to sit down with the people, but like take the brown line, sit down with people like in the city of Chicago. Take the red line or whatever.
So one more big question about big bets before we move into, hopefully there's some cards that are making their way to me to then respond to the thoughts that you have in the audience. But it is, if you were in charge of all things wonderful and magical in the city, what are the big bets that those 12 people should be pursuing here that would really transform the opportunities and the prosperity in our region? Those big bets.
Yeah. So Terry, I should say that this bank wasn't built with just love, you know, like it takes a lot of money. And I think that it requires maybe even a more nuanced sense of how resources work in order to do it, to demonstrate this kind of work. And then in an area that did not seem like Magic Johnson's Starbucks across the street, did not seem like it would be a profitable area, what people are saying is that they doubt of people's capacity to spend money where they live. And so, you know, part of what I'm thinking about, like what would I want to tell the 12 women, because I'd first not want them to be men. What would I want to tell the 12 women in a room? When I look at the proliferation of syndicated commercial and retail activity from Forever 21 to Chipotle, what I realize is that people have realized, the market understands that there is this basic need that people have for services and food and clothing, and that if we spend enough time branding and marketing those things, that people will spend more and more money on those things. And I see this growing disparity of people who have access to great education that actually teaches people to be self-thinkers, training, that I'd love to see the kind of incremental investment that we've made in Forever 21 happen with training and educational programs that kind of augment and complement the world, that there would be this kind of deep, every block, there would be something where the average person had the capacity to get really good at a thing and then be made productive, right? Because the thing that I hear in development when I talk to a general contractor or a subcontractor is like, we would hire them, but they don't have skill. We've tried to work with them, right? And that there's always this kind of like, this chasm between the job opportunity and people's capacity. I'd like to work on that in an incremental way. And I think for me, so much of it starts in education. Like if I didn't study urban planning and become like the kind of dark horse of urban planning, if I didn't know the rules of zoning code and zoning law, it would be difficult for me to have done half these things. And when people think that it's magic, it's like, it's actually not magic, it's code. And one either has access to the code or they don't. And so how do you get more people with the tools to kind of unlock the codes that govern how the world works, or how a city works, or how resources flow in a city? And I think that those are real codes that we have to give more people access to.
Yeah, and I'd say the kind of bet to make is the kind of bet that I think Charlie made, which is we could be asked to manufacture this somewhere else cheaper, but we're going to make a bet on this city that we can do it here. And the more that we can convince both large organizations and small to not just make one big bet, right? We're going to throw all our money at this great idea that we saw, and we're going to scale it up until it breaks in half. But if we can make a series of small bets, okay, for this thing that we produce and acquire from somewhere else, let's produce it here. For these kinds of ideas that we could have developed somewhere else, let's develop it here. And I think that kind of incrementalism is the kind of bet to make. It's not big bets. It's a bunch of little bets.
So we just finished this spring a 6-week that turned into an 8-week curriculum at Lane Tech High School. We took 150 kids.
Is it-
Is it the lack of microphone? Should I just project?
Isn't there an app for that, maybe?
Maybe even.
Yeah, okay.
I took my phone off the internet so it wouldn't buzz at me. We just finished a 6-week that turned into an 8-week curriculum at Lane Tech High School, where we said, let's see what kids in high school would do if we gave them the tools to think of something they wanted to discover about their school, build a device to try to collect data about that, and then analyze the data. So at the beginning of the project, they had 20-something sensors: temperature, humidity, distance, proximity sensors, light, sound, etc. And they ended up working in teams of 3, and they did 50 projects. And they came out of these projects, and just anecdotally from talking to the kids and getting email from the teachers, with a sense of confidence that they didn't have before, because we had demystified this sensing and build your own computer stuff that is still pretty mysterious, but is not hard to demystify. As an example, you know, one of the groups put a distance sensor, but instead of putting it like behind your car or putting it this way, they pointed it down from the top of the doorway going into the cafeteria, because they wanted to know the average height of kids going through that doorway. And another set of kids were like, you know, that back stairway is always really crowded, but I wonder if this other one isn't. So we're going to put a pressure sensor on the step, and we're going to count the number of times that step gets hit. You know, in the third group, we're like, we're just going to test like how rebellious the students and teachers are. We're going to put a button that says, "Do not push this button." Let's see how many people push the button.
That's pretty great.
So, you know, the investment or the bet that I would make is even pushing down younger than high school, that giving kids just a little bit of demystification and see what they will do. And I've made the statement about Array of Things before. We're really putting an infrastructure out there to support those kind of ideas and experiments that we might not think of, but these kids might.
So I can see already that the first customer for the "do not push this button" is sitting right next to you here. So, okay. We haven't talked explicitly about climate change at this point, but given that we're enjoying a nice stifling August day in June here in Chicago, there is a question about what do you see as opportunities to make our region more resilient, or I would push it even further, to make ourselves globally competitive in the area of climate change. More resilient, more competitive in an era of climate change.
You know, Terry, so many of the, like, I feel like I've been talking pretty high, but so many of the things that I really believe have to do with things that my mom or my grandmama taught me, that I think that there has to be a continued commitment to the high and low of climate change and environmentalism, and that in a way, my grandparents and my parents in Yazoo City, Mississippi were probably better sustainability experts than anybody today. That we had to understand that in addition to wind turbines and solar possibilities, there's also the idea of just like separating the slop from the paper and feeding the slop to the pigs. That there would be this like kind of understanding that there are things that are in our everyday world that people, rich and poor, high and low, able to afford Whole Foods or not, can do to make our lives better. And I also think that there needs to be some kind of campaign that says that while sustainability isn't hard, that it does require some work and thoughtfulness. I think that there's a way in which we try to like design out all the work, when in fact, part of the work is part of what like makes our bodies better. And so when people, when people talk about biking, right? Like there's this way in which I wonder, sometimes the most sustainable things actually require more of our bodies, more of our intentionality. But those are also things that help us grow. And I think that we're not encouraged to discover the possibilities of the low side of sustainability as much as we are the financial upside or the high parts.
I think if you're talking about kind of also global competitiveness and being sustainable in that respect, if you are looking at what you're doing through a lens of the individual person and their experience in that city, and you're doing it in an inclusive way, then you're going to build a city that people want to be at. You're going to, the more you can make it livable in that respect, the more folks want to be, the most folks want to be there, and then they're going to move there, and all of the good trappings that come. But I think thinking across systems, like the kind of the regional view of planning, that's CMAP is a big part of helping make possible, but really expanding that out, but having a mind to kind of the different experiences that are happening as like a system of transportation that's moving all the way from Chicago through collar suburbs and even beyond. How do we, one, plan for that system collectively, but understand there's a different set of experiences happening along it? So if we can make these kinds of strategic investments along it, we can make the whole system stronger as a whole. So I think that's part of it. Charlie?
Add in? Okay. I can appreciate the Mississippi roots. My wife's from Arkansas, and we'd spend a whole week down there with her parents, and at the end of the week, we'd have one tiny little garbage bag that would go out, because it all went to the chickens and the chicken coop and everything else, and there was no waste generated, really.
If I could add on the sustainability, I mean, some of the ideas that came out of Hurricane Sandy in New York, and kind of the conversations were called different rebuild. But thinking very differently about, for example, stormwater attenuation and how we're protecting shorelines differently. And in that case, one of the great ideas was oyster texture, which is, can you use oyster farming techniques to also serve as a barrier to high wave action, and then build a small economy around it. And then you have a harbor school that teaches kids about aquaculture that really exists in New York. And so you've kind of connected all the dots between both the physical thing you build, the resilience in terms of environmental sustainability and protecting New York's sideline, but then it's having this injection into the life of kids in the city.
Okay. So we could deploy zebra mussels to protect Northerly Island?
I think they've already been deployed. I don't know if you've been under the water.
Okay, so there's a delightful question here that I think is now empowering the audience for this, and that is, what is one thing that every person in this room can do that positively impacts our region? So it's
Come to more events like this. I mean, I think part of it is that I mentioned earlier, I was at this conference, and there's a lot of conversation about contact theory, and that you can get towards social inclusion if you can just have encounters with people who are different from you, which is a place to start. I think there's a lot more work to do. Just because you might all ride the train together doesn't mean that any difference has been broken down. But I think starting with a contact and moving toward really productive relationships, figuring out how to work on things together at that 1 foot level in your neighborhood, over a community garden, those small moments of interaction and building on those are, I think, one thing that anyone can do. There's, if you know, I think we're speaking maybe to the choir here. I mean, but if you look around, there's always a group in your own block or in your neighborhood or somebody who cares about an issue you do. But it takes work. You got to work to go and find it.
There's a behavioral psychologist at the University of Chicago named Nick Epley. And Nick did these experiments on the train from the southern suburbs in, where he was trying to figure out if people were very good at, or maybe trying to show that people are not very good at predicting what will make them happy. And so he asked them, do you think that you will have a more pleasant train ride if you talk to the stranger next to you? And most people said no, that the person doesn't want to talk to me, and it's uncomfortable. And so then he did some experiments and asked people to either talk to the person next to them or not during their next 10 rides, and then interview. But he found that if you do talk to the person next to you, it's a much more pleasant train ride. And consistently, people thought that would not make things better, but they found out if they tried it that it was actually better for them and the person next to them. So I don't do this all the time, but I do take the train, and on better days when I was at an intersection down sort of Pulaski and something near the airport, and we were scouting out locations for these Array of Things nodes. And there was a crossing guard, a black lady there as a crossing guard with a vest on, and it was like 90 degrees and she's wearing long, dark pants. And so I just struck up a conversation with her with the Nick Epley thing in mind, and we both had a very nice 60-second conversation about how it'd be nice if, just like the postmen, they would be able to wear shorts as well, but it turns out they can't. So talk to a stranger. That would be one thing you could do. The other thing you could do is talk to whoever's in charge of the crossing guards. Let them wear shorts.
Very good.
More and more I'm a part of hiring processes that are making decisions about who, say in our law firms, our planning firms, our architecture firms, our think tanks, who will we hire, and there's one spot. And when I hear the pitches for who's best, the pitches often end up being like, who's a lot like me. And so I would encourage us to really think about the kind of systematic sameness that exists in us that would make us want to just hire people that are just like us. And as a result, we struggle with a diversity of voices around what the future of our cities are, because everybody's from your hometown or your alma mater. And I think that even sometimes when we think we may not get the best person, what we often find is that we're wrong about that. And what we get in addition is this myriad of experiences that make all of the thoughts that we think better because they're more inclusive.
Great. So there are some questions targeted for individual panelists. Some are fairly long, so I'm going to hand these cards off to Theaster rather than take time to read it, and then just offer one for Charlie to respond to as you two are thinking about reading yours. And so Charlie, this one I think is from a fellow academic because it includes citations in it.
Good luck, man.
So the question
I'm in trouble
is,
now.
You got this.
can the Array of Things provide William Wyke-like analysis of public use of public projects before and after their creation?
Could I ask what that means? So I don't know that person's work.
So William White did experiments in the 1970s on Seagram's Plaza in New York.
Oh, okay, the guy with the video camera.
Yes, that guy.
Oh, okay. Didn't he write like the
social life of small urban spaces,
okay.
I think.
Yeah.
I didn't write that question. But I have a long one to read, so I'll just, let me look.
So the answer is that we hope that the Array of Things project can serve not just the atmospheric science interests of the academic community and of people, but also social and economic scientists. It's a little bit harder because we don't have I can't go online to Amazon and buy a community cohesion sensor. I can buy a temperature sensor, but I can't buy an economic sensor. So the question then is, how do I put a inanimate object, maybe one that can think digitally, on a street corner to detect those kind of things, which maybe gets back to what Theaster was talking about before with the 35 guys on the corner. So the answer is we hope
17, but it looks like 35 because they're all black and white.
Yeah.
I said 17. I mean, there might be 35.
so.
You got this. You still got this.
So we actually have 4 teams, science teams. There's the atmospheric science and environmental people. There's the transportation and civil engineering people. There's the computer scientists, and there are the social health, education, economic scientists. And this 4th team is led by Kathleen Cagney, who directs the Population Research Center at UChicago. And we have had a number of interactions. This is where the baby carriage thing I came up before. Like, if you were a social scientist watching this street scene, what would you be looking for you to be able to take in your notes? Yes, people feel good about this neighborhood, or people don't feel so comfortable about this neighborhood. What are those things you would be looking for? And to the degree that that can be captured in some way, we will increasingly over the next few years have the capability to teach the device on the corner to look for those things. Teach the device on the corner to look for the person walking a dog, or 2 baby carriages that come together for a period of time and then separate, like moms or dads talking to each other with their kids. There is, I would say, there is a startling revolution that's happening in the machine learning and artificial intelligence world that allows a vehicle to drive itself and to encounter a new situation with its software, learn from that, and then share it with all of its brothers and sisters. So, there's lots of philosophical debates about artificial intelligence, but the positive that we hope to incorporate into the array of things is to be able to take a social scientist saying, we want to be able to detect this, and compare, and then put that person together with a computer scientist and say, okay, great, now we have the baby carriage linger timer on the corner.
You want to go?
Okay. So this question is the idea of creating civic capacity for future projects I was talking about earlier, an effort to replace some of the institutions and places where civic and community organizers are working, like churches, that sort of thing. And also, is it because perhaps we're bowling alone, a reference to Robert Putnam, especially in hard-hit areas? Or are we just trying to connect the 12 people in the conference room, 12 ladies in the conference room with people and organizations in the community? And for me, I don't think it is about replacing any of the organizations, institutions that are trying to do it. And I also don't think, though, it's finding a couple of new voices and dragging them into that room with the 12 people and say, well, here we found some new community voices, and so they're speaking for everyone else. But I think it's about recognition. And it's recognition that there are lots of places where community conversations are happening and need to be had. I think the barbershop is a really important example of that we need to do a good job of, again, going out of our way to be exclusive, doing the work to meet people where they are and make sure they're connected to these larger region-wide conversations.
There was a time when Rockefeller Foundation supported the Vice Lords because they recognized the Vice Lords as being the closest thing in terms of an organizational formation that is directly connected to the people. As a result, a new strand of Vice Lords, the conservative Vice Lords, was kind of birthed. That this group of people who initially in their gang was really about protecting a place, that they were kind of the local agency. I imagine that the Vice Lords we're doing maybe what policemen do, attempting to kind of create a protection. But I think a lot about these kind of unofficial, like say, on the arts block where I'm doing work with the University of Chicago, we had this arts incubator, and then we realized we really just wanted people to gather. We didn't want to create this institute for gathering racial difference that would create economic integration. We built a freaking cafe, you know? And the cafe did the work, right? But like, we have a cafe that charges $1 for a cup of coffee because we understand that there could create economic disparity if you have to pay $4.50 for a cappuccino. And so like in all these ways that are like super practical, we were trying to say like, what would this platform be that would be the kind of convener of people in Washington Park? And it felt like the cafe would be the right kind of place, even though it doesn't have the word institute in it. And so it's like, well, how can the Chicago Community Trust support the barbershop if that's the place where the public square actually occurs? And would we choose other places that are called something else because of their name when actually the work that's happening is at the barbershop? So that is something kind of connected to this question, which is the nation and the world is starting to understand Chicago as a violent place, as the city of violence. And really that violence, when I was in planning school, it was called the urban condition. In both cases, it's about black people. It's about like black men, unemployed, time on their hands and needing to do something. So the generic answer is like, what do you do to solve it? You put them to work. It ain't that easy. Like I think about what are the systemic things that have occurred over the last 50 years that's kind of eroded dignity among poor people of whatever color. Eroded the dignity of people in the Appalachian Mountains. And I think that part of what I'd like to imagine is that there is a need for, I'll just talk for my family, 2 of my young nephews have not done very well. Those nephews grew up on the west side of Chicago at a moment when the west side wasn't so good. My 2 nephews that grew up in Naperville have done very well. And I think about like, these are my 2 sisters. Both my sisters are amazing women. What's the difference between those geographies? And it was like Titus and Yoel, who live in Naperville, had taekwondo and football and track. And they were tied up and exhausted till 9 p.m. every day because there were all these things that they didn't really have an option or the luxury of doing, that the safety net of Naperville was helping them be better citizens. And it was automatic so much so that the culture that everybody was about it was like, oh, what college are you going to? Right? And so those nephews grew up in an environment where there were just these high social expectations around their future and their time. On the west side, nobody cared about what my nephews did, or even there was no truancy guard anymore to imagine if they didn't go to school that there would be this kind of world consciousness that would say, you did something wrong, you should be in school. Like as that stuff eroded, right? And so I think that my how do you change the perception? In some ways, if we were to think about Dorchester in the bank and these things, it was really an attempt to paint a new picture, to try to say that like there are these other things happening, and that picture or that sculptural work, that the people that I'm engaged with every day in my neighborhood, that they would be able to amplify something that was like opposite of the violence. But I also think that this idea that we exhaust our young people with opportunity is super important.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
Yeah. So I learned something. I thought CAFE was an acronym of this called,
Right.
you know,
The Center for Art and Food Entertainment.
Yes, exactly.
Entrepreneurs.
Yeah. I was going for Chicago Arts for Equity, but yours are really great.
That's
So,
great.
okay. So we're here in a community that's growing vitality. The question is, can you provide examples of other neighborhoods or communities that are on this path?
So let's complicate it, like I'll have some self-critique for a minute. The work that I've been engaged in with my team of 60 people, if you work with me, can you raise your hand in the audience? There's a bunch of us, they're around. Anyway, there's about 60 of us total between the organizations. And what I realized was that a lot of the work that has been done was born, at least through Rebuild in Dorchester, it was born from me saying, I want to do this. It wasn't me asking anybody if I could do this in my neighborhood. It was me having agency in my neighborhood. I'm a black man in a black neighborhood. I've been here 10 years. I can do what I want. And that felt like the artist with agency doing things in his neighborhood. The hat that I wear at the University of Chicago is very, very different. When I'm representing a large anchor institution that has not had the best reputation in the past of kind of directly engaging its neighbors, then the terms and the conditions of engagement are totally different, right? And I had to learn that the agency that I feel on Stony Island is very different from the humility that I have to express when I'm wearing the hat of a large white anchor institution. So that feels like a kind of precursor, and that sometimes people from the outside aren't able to see the difference. So it's kind of like, here comes the Astor, guns a-blazing, right? But I think that it was really just an attempt to demonstrate impact faster, to have the proof of concept so that more people could be involved in this thing we call ethical redevelopment. The flip side is like when I think about what's happening in Pilsen, John Podmajersky Sr. Taking over some old buildings and inviting kids from the School of the Art Institute to live there in the late 70s, early 80s, buying houses from the Ukrainian families that were like leaving that neighborhood and kind of starting this thing. And then kind of looking at it as a mega real estate venture that exists on Halsted and then pervades into the neighborhoods. One of the things that would exist as a critique between what I'm doing and what John Podmajersky Jr. is doing is that there has to be more room where more people are at the table helping to make the decisions that govern how those spaces are used. And so I think that it is both at the level of the space, it's the level of the city reinvestment in those, so that if someone is getting incentivized resources to do business in a place, that they don't just have their 2 town hall meetings and then they can wash their hands of community input, but there would be like a kind of ongoing deep investigation of how those relationships could grow. And since we're right across the street from one of the sites that might be the future Obama Center, and there might be up to a $400 million reinvestment in this neighborhood, then what are the adjacent advocacy organizations that need to grow up to ensure that the redevelopment that is inevitable in this neighborhood, that it is not just on the Obama Foundation or the Chicago Community Trust or POA to imagine the futures of people in this neighborhood and equity. What are the other storefronts? What are the other storefront businesses that need to well up that can act as the advocates to ensure equity? And I think we don't spend enough time thinking about what those institutions are.
That's great. I think a plug actually for CMAP, who's working in North Lawndale on a community planning initiative, which I think that's what's great is that was sort of self-organized in terms of a group of local stakeholders. People have been doing work in North Lawndale for a long time, coming together and saying we need some technical assistance to get a larger plan for our area moving. I mean, I think that's a community that's really working hard on some of the key questions that we're talking about here. I also think West Pullman and Pullman is a really significant example. Chicago Neighborhood Initiatives, some of the work down there, working for a very long time in trying to work in that longitudinal way and getting anchor investments, also pulling in major institutional partners like the National Park Service, who's developing a national monument out of the area. And I think doing what they can to say, we have this important story here. Let's make that part and parcel of whatever we do going forward. So I think that's definitely a community in Chicago to watch.
There's a question about urban communities seem to have lost their connection to nature. How do we get planners, leaders, decision makers to value this connection to improve the quality of life for our local residents? The roots of this go all the way back to the Burnham Plan and creating public natural spaces.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Burnham Plan, look at the table of contents. Parks come before transportation. It's like my favorite thing about the plan. So I spent a long time working in parks. But I think there's all kinds of science and literature now that tells you, a kid with ADHD symptoms, it reduces symptoms in that kid if they have exposure to nature. We know that it helps with folks coping with a traumatic event. There are all kinds of things, not to mention kind of this integrated portrait of wellness that we need to be thinking about with parks. So wellness needs to include, it includes both the spectrum of obesity to malnutrition, to talking about food systems, to talking about active recreation, and then also having kind of opportunities for exposure to nature. But I think there's a colleague of mine that works at the University of North Carolina who is also a part of the diversity and inclusion effort in Seattle, who does work in predominantly African American communities and cities to say ecology is where you are. There is ecology. We don't have to necessarily say where you live doesn't count. You have to go to this big park over here, but that there's nature in the city all around you. And so it's part of our job is to really bring it out. I think if you look at the possibilities for nature around you, look at, for instance, if we're in an area that has vacant lots, for example, and you look at the Chicago Park District's study of the value of small parks, even undeveloped parks in this city, if you take out all the other confounding factors, like is it park near a railroad, all kinds of things, you just tease out exactly what parks contribute to property values. As a whole, Chicago's parks contribute 1.5% to property values within a 2-block radius of that park. Free and clear, doesn't matter what's in it, as a whole. But if you take small parks as an aggregate, with nothing in it even, it doesn't have a playground, it has nothing, just has a fence, they contribute 3.5% to property values to homes within a 2-block radius. That's huge, especially if you're thinking about things like vacant lots, right? So if we can make the argument that putting up a fence around that vacant lot, applying some programming, finding out who this small scale groups that are doing work here and getting them to activate those spaces, there's an economic argument to be made for even just starting at the very lowest level of open space and then scaling it up from there.
Great.
One of the things, I was just in Athens, and one of the things that was interesting there was people's sophisticated understanding of public space and green space. So even though Athens is a largely built city, there's green stuff all around. Like it overtakes the concrete buildings that are there. And I found myself kind of falling in love with this place, and it felt hard on the surface to see the failing economy because these plants were growing. Like there was this kind of this joy of walking down the street because I was in the Mediterranean, and there was this kind of foliage like all around me that sheltered, that made me feel better, even though I knew the kind of deep conditions of the place. And I keep thinking in the same way about these empty lots, that we put such stigma in the language of vacancy and vacated lots that it becomes hard to imagine that these things are sites for amazing cultural and food production. And that if we were able to, again, connect some of these old technologies and old histories of the Victory Garden on up, then some of these issues of question of obesity and like all of those things feel like they're deeply connected.
Yeah.
But again, where does seeds fall from the earth from? Like if seeds could fall like guns, we'd be a really green and abundant place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For those of you tweeting, I think we just had a tweetable moment there. So there's a series of questions about the issue of the individual sense of control in these planning and change processes, ensuring that community members maintain a sense of control, helping government to shift to include voices and be respectful and accountable for those voices as we go through the process. What are your thoughts about that relationship between our government institutions and the communities need to have a sense of control and efficacy in these planning processes.
I mean, I think those relationships need to get better. I think, you know, most cities, I think, have departments or agencies that are trying very hard to build these connections, but part of it also means that you have to give up control of some of that process to community members on the ground. Allowing people in, I think, is part of it. But I think it's definitely, it's challenging, but you know, there are organizations here, even in Chicago, that I think have figured out how cities can play this technical assistance role that allows communities to control those spaces. I mean, a shameless plug for a group like Neighborspace that I sit on is this great quasi-governmental organization that is just the connective tissue for community gardens in Chicago. So they don't manage the gardens. They help get them built by taking city money and county money and grants, but they cultivate the community group. And so Mrs. Jones, who's managing that garden by herself, can connect with other people in the neighborhood to do it. And when Mrs. Jones is too tired to take care of it anymore, you have Neighborspace there to keep it going, to help build those connections. And I think when civic institutions can play that kind of role, then you can get more people to the table. I think the other thing that I want to throw out there, I don't know if anyone's reading Street Fight right now by Janet Sadik Khan, who was head of transportation in New York for about 6 years under Bloomberg. And she sort of talks about this tension between both people wanting this Robert Moses style vision, which is basically take out the bulldozers and build highways and parks where you want to, but it's there's a lot comes with that. But then the Jane Jacobs view, right, which is this sort of, we want to have this wonderful ballet of street life. We want to really support the kind of local homegrown things that are happening on the street, and the street matters. And she talks about how right now, in trying to deliver these big public projects, there's this tension between, you have people using the rhetoric of Jane Jacobs, which is felt as kind of the nice community-based, bottoms-up kind of approach to prevent any kind of large-scale intervention, even the medium-scale intervention. So there's something happening in this conversation right now, and I tell you, I've been in 10 conversations where the references are all back to kind of 1970s conversations about design and space and like environmental design, crime prevention through environmental design is coming back as an idea. What do we do with that? Those are the kinds of, I think, kind of standards and lenses for design that we sort of need to go find those community networks and drop it in there and say, okay, what should this mean going forward? Because there's definitely this moment of trying to rethink how we talk about all this stuff.
Charlie, do you want to weigh in on this?
Oh, I feel a bit of a disadvantage talking about urban design as a computer scientist. You know, just sort of tying these comments together with the nature space. We've been working with a guy, Mark Berman at UChicago, who studies nature and how people respond in cities in particular. Toronto has inventoried every tree in the city, and Mark just looked for correlations between the green space around you and your health, and found positive ones. One thing that I found interesting, because that sort of, to me, that seems intuitive, that, you know, having trees around, we all like shade on the hot day. But he also said that as we're walking through a space, whether it's through the Chicago Loop or through Jackson Park, there are two levels of consciousness happening. There's the things that we're thinking about, but then there's this lower level of maybe reflexive sort of conscious or activities where we're watching to make sure we don't step out in front of a bus, or we're paying attention for other things. And what he found was that walking through green space allows that second part of your consciousness to relax in a more restorative way. So, and it's not clear whether that's because of the geometry of trees versus buildings, or because you're able to relax and not have to worry about stepping out in front of a vehicle. But there is some interesting science behind why these green spaces are important in cities.
Is this the same guy Puts the EEGs on people as they walk through space.
He might be. I don't know about that.
Yeah, there's a Toronto brain scientist that puts the brain sensors on you as you walk through space. And what was kind of interesting about this 2 levels of experience, he was explaining to me, who I could barely follow, but there was something like, when you ask someone about their experience crossing a street or being in a park, they'll tell you one set of things about their experience. And often, if it's a familiar intersection, say, yeah, I have no problem crossing the street. But then he measures actually both the sensors, but then your blink rate. Like the more you blink, the more you're thinking hard, apparently. So you're all gonna look at each other now. The more you're thinking hard about what you're trying to do. And so what was actually physically happening to people's bodies and their experience was very different than what they were saying was happening to them. And I think that is an important role that science can help play here as sort of a check on, and again, it's like any anthropological exercise. The person who's asking a question has a big influence on what kind of answer they're going to get, right? But I think that's kind of an interesting piece to bring to the way we think about living in cities and what we're building there.
Yeah, we did some, with some folks at the Harris School, we did some work to try to predict crime based on certain predictors like past crimes in a place, but also on changes in weather. And it turns out that when there's a change, first nice weekend in the spring, for example, when people first coming out, you see violence happen, and pretty reliably. And I got to thinking about that. Well, if it's temperature related that causes people to be on average more aggressive, then is it really just the air temperature, or is it possible that it's the heat radiating from the concrete? So that air temperature doesn't really give us the whole picture, but if we look at the concrete and the heat that's coming up off the concrete, then that would tell us, well, plant more trees, and not only changes the air temperature, but also the sense of what you're feeling like as you're walking through.
So I want to go through 2 final questions very quickly, so short answers. One is, what's the one piece of conventional wisdom that you would say is outdated or no longer relevant?
What do you got, Theaster?
Outdated wisdom. I don't know, growing up, there was this sense that I was leaving a generation of interdependence to join a class of individualists. And that the world was explaining to me in undergrad and grad that the best thing I could do is kind of separate from my family and pursue my intellectual and economic needs to the chagrin of anybody from my past. And that individualism was the only way that I would be able to ensure a certain kind of place in life, and I just think that's bullshit.
In addition to bullshit, I think, conventional sense that a lot of the disciplines associated with building the civic realm, so you have planning, and you have urban design and architecture and all these pieces, any idea that there's some kind of rigidity between those boundaries should be tossed away. I mean, I think anyone can play the role that those disciplines are playing. There's expertise in there and you want it at the table, but it's not as if a planner doesn't have something to say about architecture, or someone who lives on the block doesn't have something to say about urban design. So I think it's getting rid of some of those boundaries, letting go of that is a way of not subscribing to kind of those conventional setups.
And Charlie, I think you'll be talking about vacuum tubes maybe, or something like that. No.
They vacuum tubes still make really good amplifiers. I don't know if it's conventional wisdom, but I think in my own experience growing up from before the age of PCs until today, that there's a distinct separation between us as people and the technology that we use. I think we're starting to already see how those things, how we're affected by the technology that we use. And and that we have to make conscious decisions about our use of technology so that it doesn't change us in ways we would look back later and say, I wish I'd actually talked to my wife over dinner instead of checking Facebook, right? She won't let me do that, by the way.
Yeah, so the last question, and I think we'll end on a much more uplifting, optimistic tone, and it refers to your comment about doubling down on Chicago. And so in your summary comment here, what you see as our strongest asset, what we can build on to help to inform on to 2050, what those planners need to get right in this plan. How do we double down?
Yeah. One thing that's encouraging about this room, well, this room is encouraging because it represents all of the leadership, or a large portion of the leadership that will help shape our cities. We all have to believe that we have a much more vital role than the cog that we might imagine ourselves in our corporations and institutions. And it's just a kind of anthem to be bolder and feel the leadership that is inside you to do more to affect change in the neighborhoods and in the city that we live in.
Yeah, I double down on that. I mean, I think the way we move forward is by trying to be inclusive and doubling down on that idea that it's just, you cannot take enough opportunities to make the tent as big as possible. You know, I say about the circus tent, right? You have one pole in the center and the tent just flaps. It's the margins that hold that tent up. And so if we actively pursue the margins of our society together and bring the margins to the table, that's what we can do differently. That's how we can bring it forward and build on that legacy. In Chicago, we are about vision. We just have to build it together.
I'd say, you know, Chicago, when you go to other places, whether you're in Athens or the conference you were at with people from Barcelona and Copenhagen, at least in the conferences I go to that are about information and data analytics and things, Chicago is really seen as one of the leading cities for just publishing data, responsibly publishing data, but publishing data for people to use about how the city is working. And one of the reasons it's known for that is, of course, because somebody, made the decision to publish the data. There's another reason that I think is even more important, and that is that the people of Chicago wanted to take that data and learn from it. And so you have these weekly, bi-weekly meetings happening all around the city where, I got an email from a crossing guard on the northwest side recently saying, please put one of those things in my corner. I'm there 2 hours a day and I'm seeing this and that about, traffic and things like that. We have people who are really interested in using information to make their neighborhood better. And I think doubling down, I'd say, and this is somewhat, admittedly, this is somewhat self-serving to say, don't shy away from things like the array of things, this thing up on the pole. Make it something that you could be comfortable with. Don't get comfortable with what we tell you, but help us make it something that you can use and help us change it so that you can embrace it and use that information to make your neighborhood what you want it to be.
So my favorite part of the Burnham plan is the section on page 8 where he talks about the spirit of Chicago and what we can and surely will bring to pass that benefits everybody in the region. And I think that to me was the organizing principle around which that entire plan was based. Today, I think you are a reflection of that spirit of Chicago, the fact that you are coming out, being engaged in this process. I want to acknowledge CMAP and their commitment to broad engagement and inclusion in the planning process that will separate this iteration of our region's plan from all those that came before it. And those before it had remarkable civic engagement on which they were based as well. But this feels different. This is a different moment in time. I think that the future of Chicago hangs in the balance as we're looking at a place that people are leaving, that people are wondering about, will they have an opportunity here? We see Mary Mitchell's column about African Americans who feel that they cannot be successful here, so they go other places to enjoy that success that comes with the talents and education they can bring to bear on the commerce and nonprofit opportunities in our community. We can change that future because of this door open. You've all demonstrated that commitment and that love of our region, and this place couldn't be better. It's a transformed building. For years I would drive down Stony and it was boarded up and walled off, chain link fence and all of that. And Theaster, he's just an ordinary guy, no different than in the rest of us. And if he can do that with this place, think about if everybody here found our Stony Island Bank that we would commit to bring to life, to bring life back into these buildings, these communities, these neighborhoods. This will be the best place in the world to live, raise a family, work, and play. And I think that's the commitment of CMAP and their work. So I want to thank them for organizing this, and I want to thank our fabulous superstar panelists of Theaster, Charlie, and Gia.